Good morning, this is Marshall Davis. Today I'm covering two sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, sayings 34 and 35. I'm covering two because they're short and also they're making the same point. And they're also very similar to sayings that we find in the New Testament Gospels. And so the difference in interpretation is really a matter of context. Here are the two sayings as found in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, if a blind person leads a blind person, both of them will fall into a hole. Jesus said, one can't enter a strong person's house and take it by force without tying his hands. Then one can loot his house. The first one is the famous blind leading the blind saying. In the Gospel of Thomas, there's no context for this saying. It's because the Gospel of Thomas is simply a collection of sayings with very little, if any, context. That means that Jesus could have said these sayings at any time and place. This is similar to the context that we find in the Gospel of Luke, where the blind leading the blind saying is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's version of the more famous Sermon on the Mount. That sermon is simply a collection of sayings. So again, they can refer to anyone. In the Gospel of Matthew, the blind leading the blind saying is found in the context of the Pharisees and scribes who are arguing with Jesus. When the disciples come to him and they tell him what the Pharisees are saying, Jesus says, let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. So the blind guides in Matthew are the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders. Now, how do we interpret the saying in the Gospel of Thomas? First of all, this refers to the truth that we were talking about last time. The kingdom of God is hiding in plain sight for all to see. You have to be spiritually blind not to see it. So that's what Jesus is referring to here. Jesus often said, he who has eyes to see, let him see. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus is implying that that non-dual reality is obvious. If you can't see it, you're blind, spiritually speaking. If you are a religious leader in this condition, then you are the blind leading the blind. Now, because there's no context for the saying in Thomas, this can refer to any leaders. I think in the Gospel of Thomas, it is referring to church leaders, not Jewish leaders. The Gospel of Thomas was written as a response to the message that was being preached by apostles who were not part of the original 12, but who had taken over the early Christian movement, namely Paul and James. These two men quickly came to dominate the early Christian movement, and as a result, the original gospel of Jesus was quickly becoming lost. Earliest Christianity was quickly turning away from the gospel of Jesus to the gospel of circumcision and works proclaimed by James, and a transactional gospel proclaimed by Paul. Neither of these of the gospel of the kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed. Thomas's gospel focuses on the original non-dual message of Jesus. For that reason, I think that when Thomas wrote this, he recorded these sayings that the blind guides were referring to Christian leaders who had abandoned the gospel of Jesus. And in applying it to today, I would say that the blind guides of today are the religious leaders who have abandoned the original gospel of Jesus and have instead adopted a gospel of Christianity that was developed over the centuries, a kind of intellectual and doctrinal, creedal, hierarchical substitute. People who were proclaiming that were the blind guides. Over Columbus Day weekend, our little New Hampshire town hosted an agricultural fair. Every year at this fair, there is a religious tent that seeks to evangelize fairgoers. They have a banner on the front of the tent that asks, "Are you a good person?" And if you take the bait, which is a free bottle of water, then you are seated down and you are subjected to an evangelistic spiel that seeks to convince you that you are a bad person, destined for hell, unless you adopt their version of the gospel. These evangelists are blind guides. They think they are saving people from hell, but they are leading people into a deep hole of their warped version of the Christian gospel. If a blind person leads a blind person, both of them will fall into a hole, Jesus said. Thomas saw James and Paul as these type of blind guides. Unfortunately, those men became the dominant voice of the church, and as the centuries went on, it was especially Paul who had the dominant voice. In time, this form of Christianity banned all other gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas. The second saying, verse 35, is similar. Jesus said, "One can't enter a strong person's house and take it by force without tying his hands. Then one can loot his house." Once again, this saying is very similar to one found in the canonical Gospels. In fact, we find this in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In these Gospels, it is found in the context of Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. In Matthew, Jesus heals a man, and then he is accused of doing it by the power of the devil. The Pharisees said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." In response to that, Jesus responds with a parallel to our verse in Thomas. He says, "But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the Spirit of God has come upon you. Or how can someone enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? Then indeed he may plunder his house." And so exorcism is the canonical setting of the saying. In Thomas, we have no setting. So we do not know the original setting in which Jesus spoke these words. I tend to think it is the same context as the previous verse. That is the church leaders, Paul and James, who are the strong men. James was the strong man of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem church, after the death of Jesus. He was the brother of Jesus. And because of that family connection, he quickly took over power. He took the reins of the Jerusalem Christian movement, even though he was not one of the 12. The other strong man was the Apostle Paul, who was at odds both with the Apostle James, as we see in the Acts of the Apostles, as well as in the epistles. Peter and John are the only other apostles in the New Testament that really have any type of authority in the early church. But the epistles of Paul depicts Peter as wishy-washy, just like he was during the lifetime of Jesus. He was overshadowed by both Paul and James. His only claim to fame was that he was supposedly the first bishop of Rome, which is how the Roman Church claims its authority. The Apostle John is more non-dual in his approach. But John had not written a gospel at the time that Thomas collected these sayings of Jesus. And the gospel that now bears John's name was actually written by someone else. It says that right at the end of the book, although it also says that it was based on the testimony of John. But it was not published until after John's death and after Thomas's death. The non-dual message of John is presented in that gospel, but alongside and in many places overshadowed by the traditional editorial editions by the final author, compiler, and editor of the Gospel of John. Only Thomas was penning the original words of Jesus without a narrative that determined how they were going to be interpreted. The other Gospels put the saying about the strong man in the context of Jesus driving out demons. Mark did this first, and then the other two Gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, copied that and put it into theirs. But what if exorcism was not the original context of the saying? I don't think it was. I think that in Thomas's mind, the strong man is Paul, or maybe James, or maybe both. I think that the strong man's house is the church, the household of faith, which was the emerging religion that came to be called Christianity, that was being formed around the teachings of James and Paul. Already in the early first century, the gospel of Jesus was becoming lost. Thomas saw that happening. That's why he wrote his gospel. He recorded these unadorned sayings of Jesus to bind the strong men who were leading the church in the wrong direction. That is why the strong men of the church eventually banned the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was written to bind the strong men with the authentic words of Jesus. He knew that the words of Jesus held power. He hoped that putting the words of Jesus directly in the people's hands without the church's interpretation would be a way to bind these men. One cannot enter a strong person's house and take it by force without tying his hands. Then one can loot his house. Thomas, you could say, was the first reformer of the church. He was seeking to rescue the church from men like James and Paul, neither of whom followed Jesus during his ministry, neither of whom ever heard Jesus preach. And they hardly ever quote Jesus at all. When they do, it's sayings we don't know about elsewhere. Thomas's plan, though, didn't work. Pauline Christianity became dominant. Thomas Christianity was sidelined. Perhaps that is why Thomas journeyed to India. If church tradition is to be believed, Thomas may have hoped that in a new land he could proclaim the authentic gospel of Jesus without interference from the church authorities, from the strong men. At least that's how I read it. Thomas is not talking about demons and exorcism, which he has no interest in. There's no mention of exorcism or demons in his gospel. He is interested only in proclaiming the authentic teachings of Jesus Christ, which proclaim the non-dual reality that he called the kingdom of God. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.